he makes the cardinal error of saying that it equals 1.618. Now, I know you can't fit an entire infinite decimal in a book because it's infinite, but it's not an exact number. And one of the beautiful properties of this number phi is that it is an irrational number in that its decimal expansion goes on forever, like pi. And that, in fact, is one of the key reasons why the writer Luca Pacioli back in the 16th century wrote about this number, called it the divine proportion, because it goes on forever and is unknowable like God. So if you just cut it off at its prime like that in a cruel way, after 3 digits of the decimal, and say that it equals this number, that made me very upset.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Professor Sarah Hart. Sarah is a mathematician and author and a fellow of Gresham College, London, where she recently served a 4-year term as professor of geometry, the first woman to hold this chair since its creation in 1597. Sarah is particularly interested in the cultural, historical, and creative impact of mathematics and the links between mathematics and the arts. We talk today about her first book, Once Upon a Prime, The Wondrous Connections Between Mathematics and Literature, which won the Mathematical Association of America's Euler Book Prize in 2024. My conversation with Sarah starts with the connections between mathematics and literature, including references to Shakespeare, Herman Melville, George Eliot, Lewis Carroll, Douglas Adams, and more. Good writing has structure, and structure can be understood in mathematical terms. Sarah explains how mathematics can greatly enrich one's enjoyment and appreciation of literature. Sarah also describes how mathematics can be used to obfuscate rather than clarify, and the similarities and differences in being a female mathematician today as in the 19th century. It is with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Professor Sarah Hart. Professor Sarah Hart, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to have you on the podcast because I read and enjoyed your book, Once Upon a Prime. It was a fun read, and it merged 2 of my passions. So I'm not sure if you know this, but although I'm not a mathematician, I do have an undergraduate degree in mathematics. And I've always been a voracious reader. So your book was kind of a melding of 2 different passions of mine, and to see both in one book was a lot of fun. And so I enjoyed it. Now, your subtitle is The Wondrous Connections Between Mathematics and Literature. And I would like you to expand on that, because before I read your book, I was, skeptical, I'd say, is a fair thing. Authors write about everything, right? People wake up in the form of a bug, or faster than light travel, or history, and emotions and philosophy. So people write about all things. So there's no reason for mathematics to be excluded from what authors write about. But your subtitle implies that there's a deeper connection between mathematics and literature, which before reading your book was not obvious to me. So can you please justify for us why there are deep and as you call them, wondrous connections between mathematics and literature?
So I'll do my best. I think for me, it's all about how we as human beings create things. And we don't often think about mathematics and literature being, connected in any way. So it's perhaps a surprise to people. we perhaps put mathematics in in a science box. We talk about mathematics as being the language of the universe and think about it as being exclusively a technological thing, a useful subject if you want to do science. But the reason that mathematics is useful for science is the same reason as we find it in literature. It's because the universe is full of structure and pattern and symmetry. And so, we human beings, we love those things. We have an innate appreciation of pattern and structure. We enjoy them in our art, in our music. And it's therefore feels very natural to me as a mathematician to see structure and pattern arising in literature because we love those things as human beings. So, the first most obvious place we might think of to look for those connections is in poetry, because poetry is absolutely full of pattern and structure. And so, when I begin thinking about these kinds of questions, we can start by talking about poetry, which has rhythms and rhymes and all of those kinds of things. And there's so much mathematical connection there. But you also get it in novels, in all forms of writing. There are patterns and structures, and wherever there are patterns and structures, there is mathematics. So that's a really deep connection. But it doesn't stop there, because when we read even something as simple as a fairy tale or a folk tale, and we hear these things when we're little children, they are full of mathematical symbolism in the form of numbers. So that's just the start, really, of these connections. Language itself has mathematical connections, and the structure and pattern behind writing does as well. So that's where I started off.
Right, and you give several examples in your book of how one of the things that I didn't make a connection before reading your book was how of course, when we think of literature, we do think of structure, right? We think of plot, we think of characterization, we think of introductions and dialogue, and all of these things. They can take different forms, but they are structured. And if it's unstructured, it doesn't make for good writing or for good reading. And the connection that I didn't make, so that wasn't new to me. But what was new to me is that is essentially what you just said. Where you have structure, you have mathematics,
Yeah.
And that was like it was a connection that I hadn't really made. So you do give many examples in your book. I'm going to ask you to pick one, or just describe, like, make that connection for our listeners who haven't yet read your book, I'm assuming. But make that connection explicit. How is it that structure can be looked at mathematically, and how mathematical appreciation or a mathematical understanding, can lead to a greater appreciation of the craft and the art of good writing?
Mm. Yeah, so I think one of my favorite examples of where a structure is used that makes the book have even more richness and strength to its message is the wonderful book by Eleanor Catton, The Luminaries, which has this fabulous hidden structure to it, which you experience it when you're reading the book. You may not necessarily have the detailed awareness of the mathematics that's going on, but that really does change your experience of reading the book, and it enriches and adds to the book's themes. So the book itself, it's a wonderful book. It's got everything you might want in a plot, because it's got love and betrayal and murder and stolen gold and mystery, and it's just brilliant. But actually, the book itself is something of a meditation on the tension between choice and free will and fate and destiny and all of these things. And so one of the themes in the book is, or one of the pieces of structure that she uses, the author Eleanor Catton, is she has links to the 12 signs of the zodiac. That's not the mathematical bit, but she has this number 12 and 12 characters that are associated to the signs of the zodiac. And then there are two key characters, those are the luminaries of the title, representing the sun and the moon. And to mirror those themes and ideas, the mathematical bit of the structure is that there are 12 sections or chapters in the book, and each one is exactly half the length of the one before. So it's really nice. This reflects kind of the waning of the moon because the chapters are getting shorter and shorter, and that simple idea that halving and halving and halving in mathematics, and we call this a geometric sequence or progression, and what this does for you when you read the book, even if you don't know exactly what's happening with the lengths, you experience that as a quickening of the pace as the book goes on. The chapters are getting shorter and shorter. You feel like the gear wheels are turning for the characters. And then by the time you get to that final chapter, it's a very short little chapter at the end. There's just two characters who are having a discussion, the two lovers of the title, the luminaries. It's set chronologically in about the middle of the action, but we are coming to it last, so we know what those lovers don't know. By that point, their fate is sealed. So there's kind of caught up in this structure, this lovely mathematical pattern, and it really, you do experience that when you read the book. So it's not done for no reason. It's a constraint that it's quite a strong constraint, and this is another point that I try to make, that actually rules and constraints do not stop creativity happening. They inspire you to be creative, because you've got to think of the right choice of words. If you're writing a haiku,
Right.
for instance, you have 17 syllables to set up your situation, and then get to the end and have your payoff. And that's really, really, really a tight restriction. That number 17, you've got to do it in that, and that makes you think, how will I express my idea? So it's
I have actually, just from my personal experience, I found that I'm far more creative when I have even a completely arbitrary constraint to work under. Like if someone says write something, I said, like, okay, what do you want me to write? Like what topic? How long do you want it? Do you want fiction, nonfiction? And if someone just says, I don't care, make it as long or short about any topic, whatever you want. Yeah. I'm like, what do I say? Like, I've actually had a lot of trouble. Like, I don't even know how to get started. And but I've been in other situations where it's been, okay, I need this, and it needs to be like, and like here are some pretty tight constraints, and you've got to, and it's like, oh, okay, I can work within that. And I've written some like really, some good stuff but by having the constraints essentially has made me both more creative, but also more productive, because like, okay, I can sort of, eliminate all of that possibility space over there. And so I can actually see I've still got a place to work in and to play in. But I can see it all and I can grasp it all. And so by having these constraints, I actually am more productive, more creative. And I guess that's not just me, but that's true for others as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is, mathematicians often liken themselves to being akin to poets, because in both disciplines you want to express your ideas concisely. You're choosing just the right words. There's this idea of the aesthetic beauty of a poem is coming from that constraint of, I'm writing a sonnet, I've got 14 lines, and I've got rhyme scheme, and I've got the rhythm of that poem, and within that Shakespeare writes beautiful, beautiful sonnets, and it's the same.
Iambic pentameter, not an easy meter to stick with.
No, so and that, as you say, that once you have that restriction, it gives you something to work with, and it gives you something to push against. That heightens your I think your imagination, your creativity, and mathematics does the same kind of thing, because we don't just start with nothing. In mathematics, you start with ground rules. You start with, in geometry, for instance, you start with axioms that say, okay, we will just all agree that between any 2 points you have in space define a line. Okay, and we all accept that that's true, and then you set up this world, this system, and then you play, as you say. So in mathematics, we play and explore and be creative, and it's the same thing with literature. We set up some rules for ourselves, and then we play.
Yeah, and one of the things that I learned that took me by surprise is that there are some fairly important mathematical concepts and theorems that were anticipated or preceded by writers, by authors, in literature. And one of the things was I learned as an undergrad about something called the Fibonacci sequence.
Yes.
So can you take a moment, describe what I know and what you know as the Fibonacci sequence, and probably what most of my listeners, if they know it at all, know it as the Fibonacci sequence. But this is not a case where the originator or the discoverer of the sequence
Yeah.
earned the name. Fibonacci is not the person who invented it. It was preceded by others, or by at least one person. So can you tell us what it is and a little bit of the story, and then why we know it as the Fibonacci sequence?
Yeah. So the so-called Fibonacci sequence is a really simple sequence of numbers, and there's a rule that is used to make this sequence. And the rule is you start with a 1, and then you have a 2, and then the next number is made by adding the last two numbers. So 1, 2, 1 plus 2 is 3. So the next number is 3. Then you've got 2, 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. The next number is 5. 3 and 5 is 8. So 8. 5 and 8 is 13. So you can make the sequence, and the very, very simple rule, just add the last two terms together, and that gives you the next one. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, and so on and so on and so on to infinity. So this is a lovely sequence. It crops up surprisingly often. It crops up in nature where, for example, plants, flower petals often come in threes or fives or 13s or 34s. And you see these numbers in nature. But where it was first, this sequence looked at and discovered was when many centuries ago in India, mathematicians who were often poets as well, were studying what the possible rhythmic patterns of speech and poetry could be. And in that tradition, you have stressed and unstressed syllables, rather like we do in Western poetry. But there's a difference. The stressed syllables, to emphasize that stress, they last longer. You take longer to say them. And conventionally, they last twice as long as the unstressed syllables. So in that setup, then you might ask yourself, well, okay, what are my possibilities if I want a phrase that lasts 4 beats? What are the possibilities here for my pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables? Or in the terminology that is used, lagu means unstressed, that's short, and guru is stressed, and that means that is a longer syllable, last 2 beats. So if you count these things up, you find that the number of possibilities actually gives you what we now call the Fibonacci sequence. And the reason for it is that let's say you know how many ways there are to make 4 beats, and maybe how many ways there are to make 3 beats. Then if you want to make a 5-beat pattern, you can take all the ways to make 4 beats and add one more beat, a short beat, a lagu beat. And alternatively, you could take all the 3-beat patterns and add one long guru syllable. And so the number of ways to make a 5-beat pattern is the number of ways to make a 4-beat pattern plus the number of ways to make a 3-beat pattern. That's exactly the rule that defines the Fibonacci sequence. So this is how it was first encountered, this sequence. And it was mathematicians and poets, most famously Pingala, who was around about 2,000 years ago, wrote this treatise on poetry and the mathematics of rhythm. And this is where this sequence is first seen in Indian mathematicians and poets studying rhythm. And the reason it's called the Fibonacci sequence nowadays, at least in the English-speaking world, is that there was a mathematician who actually his nickname was Fibonacci, but he was called Leonardo. He came from Pisa, and his father was a trader who traded across kind of the Arab world and India, and he traveled around, and the young Fibonacci was with him, and he learnt some of the mathematics that was being used in that part of the world, one thing he learned was what we now use as our number system. So the Hindu Arabic numerals, that they were brought back by Fibonacci, and he wrote a book saying these numbers are great. Let's use these now instead of Roman numerals. But in that book, he also introduced as a little puzzle this sequence, and said it was a solution. He made a little puzzle about breeding pairs of rabbits and how many will there be after so many months. And the answer to it was this little sequence. So he didn't introduce it in the context of poetry, but in the context of a puzzle about rabbits. But that's why we now, we have given this sequence the name Fibonacci sequence, although it was known centuries earlier when people were investigating patterns of poetry.
So you just said something that that I also didn't know, is that not only did he introduce, at least to a European audience at the time, the concept of what we now call the Fibonacci sequence, but he also introduced Arabic numerals.
Yeah.
Is that? So this guy's contribution was.
Oh yeah.
He didn't create either the sequence or the numerical system, but by introducing both to Europe. So it was from India that he learned about Arabic numerals and brought that back to, because obviously it is far superior to the Roman numeral system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating. In fact, you can see if you look at the way he introduced it, he introduced these things. He said, right, these symbols 98765432 they were written like that from left to right, and that, for me, that tells me already that's not the intuitive way to write numbers. But of course, if you're writing in Arabic, you write from right to left. So he's written it down almost like getting it from that context. And then 0. And this 0, there isn't a 0 in Roman numerals. So 0 is such a crucially important number for any kind of, if you're starting to write decimals and all of these things, you need 0 if you're going to write down mathematics in the way we do it now. And he introduced these, and in fact, that's another place in literature where we see mathematical ideas arising in Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare came from a generation where his father's generation would have learnt Roman numerals at school and learnt how to use those. His generation in England, it took a while, you see, to get from Italy all the way up to England. His generation was the first who would be taught these new numbers. And so it's an exciting new concept for him. And because Shakespeare's Shakespeare and he explores interesting ideas in his writing, the idea of 0 in particular is this new, strange, newfangled thing, which they originally called cipher or zephyr. And that's where we get the word cipher from, for something slightly hidden or unknown. He has references to 0 or cipher in his plays as this strange new thing. He sort of plays with this idea, and you can almost see it happening. So that's, it's really exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, there are questions asked in literature that are still relevant today. And one of the things that struck me was you talk about Herman Melville and George Eliot, two classic writers, but what they struggle with, or what they investigate in their literature, is to what extent can information about a population, if you know a lot about a population as a whole, how much can you infer? How much can you confidently know about a single individual, right? And with Melville, it was about whales, of course, right? There was one whale in particular that he wrote a whole book about, or wrote a book about a captain's obsession with a particular whale. But also in George Eliot, like that, there, how much can you know about a single person if you know something or a fair bit about the group? So can you expand on that? Like, what was the knowledge at the time, and why that's actually still a very relevant question today?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the 19th century, you start to get statistics really becoming important and studied. And so again, the writers of the day pick up on these ideas and discuss them, through the form of literature. So the word statistics actually comes from um, German word statistic, which is about essentially the mathematics of the state, the country. It's numbers to do with the people who live in your country, what's your population, those kinds of things. Used to be called in England, it used to be called political arithmetic, which is kind of funny. But so the origin of statistics and understanding these facts about populations was really starting with things like the first census in modern times. So in Britain, that was the first one was in the very early 19th century. Even there was a lot of suspicion and worry about what are we saying about a population? Is it right to be getting information about things like, divorce rates or literacy rates? Because aren't these at the time, you sort of felt to be moral questions about what people were like, rather than, how tall is somebody might be more morally neutral, but people genuinely worried about when you start gathering information about things that may have an ethical dimension. Famously, there was a very pioneer of sociology, Emile Durkheim, who gathered information about suicide rates in France, and this was a question of you know, we are now trying to understand a population in terms of kind of the ethical and moral decisions that are being made, and this really worried people. They were thinking, isn't this kind of beyond what we should be doing in terms of counting?
So
But then,
was there a concern about because statistics were new that
mm,
if we start measuring that, one in 50,000 or one in 10,000, I don't know what the numbers were, but
yeah,
that a certain number of people are going to commit suicide in a certain year, that we are in some way causing this to happen? Am I do remember when we aligned our calendars
mm,
between the United States and Europe, right? Because
mm,
they were offset by 2 weeks at one point
yes,
between the Julian and the I'm
Gregorian,
blanking on
the
on
Gregorian calendar, yeah,
yes, like Gregorian and the Julian
yeah,
calendars, right? They were offset by 2 weeks. And so the US was going to jump ahead by
mm,
2 weeks. And people were like, there was actually a scare in the
mm,
US. People were concerned that they were going to lose 2 weeks of their life, right?
yes,
Their lives
yeah,
would be shortened by 2 weeks, or that by, they're losing 2 weeks.
mm,
And it was like, no, it's just the measurement system. The
yeah,
time itself is independent. Was
yeah,
there a concern similar to or analogous to that by measuring suicide rates or by collecting statistics, we were actually causing these bad things to happen in
there
some
was
way?
Yeah, it's really interesting to look back on these times. So there's a famous comment from Charles Dickens, who said, he was looking at if we know what, say, the death rate or the murder rate is going to be, based on averages, and it's got to, October, and there's only been 50 murders so far this year, but we know that actually the statistics say there are going to be 60 murders, and isn't it awful to think that 10 people are definitely going to be killed by the end of the year, which is, it's, yeah, it's an interesting outlook on this, and I think, but still, human beings are not great with probability and statistics. I think we know this, and there's this temptation to think that, for instance, the gambler's fallacy, or if you've tossed a coin 10 times and it's come up heads every time, then it's definitely more likely to be tails the next time. This sort of perception that random processes have a memory. And I think that's part of it, that it feels as if, seeing a trend or being told a trend almost forces an outcome to happen, which isn't the case, but it's very tempting to think that. And George Eliot, so we mentioned her, she was she loved mathematics, and she was really interested in these new ideas of probability and statistics. And in fact, a lot of her books mention statistics, probability ideas. Silas Marner, for instance, even a man's fate is decided by drawing lots at one point. So at the start of the book, Silas Marner is accused of a crime, and his community draws lots to decide whether or not he's guilty of it. So they say, we think that God will make the the draw come up in his favor if he's innocent. So that's so let God decide by rolling dice, which Albert Einstein didn't think God played dice, but that's another conversation. But yeah, so yeah,
I wouldn't want a justice system that I was
uh,
subject to
exactly.
follow that process. I would
Yeah,
much prefer evidence to be.
yeah, I think that's fair.
I guess unless actually, on the other hand, if I was a person who committed a bunch of crimes, I might actually be in favor of that.
Yes, I think
Personally, I think I prefer evidence and reason and proof to the extent that we're capable
yes,
of
yes.
obtaining it to be determinative of whether someone is convicted of a crime.
I think that's right. So yes, I'm glad we don't do that anymore. But in George Eliot's other book, Daniel Deronda, really that all. I mean, it's almost a novel version of the gambler's fallacy, right? Because it starts with our heroine. She's in a casino. She's gambling. She loses. She wins a bit, and then she loses. And there's this sort of feeling that if you carry on tossing coins or rolling dice, then eventually your number will come up. You'll get lucky because the laws of probability say that's likely to happen. But of course, what you don't know is how long it's going to take. And so this is the thing that gamblers fall prey to, that they keep sitting at that roulette table and they keep losing, and then they lose all their money. They can't carry on forever. And in the novel, it's kind of a playing out of that idea through the whole novel, because without wanting to spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it,
Well, it's been over 100 years, I
yeah,
think.
yeah. Do you think people have had the chance to do it? But the fortunes of the people in the novel go up and they go down, and there are sort of accidents and incidents that occur, but things haven't actually come out all right at the end for for the characters. And it's like we've finished the novel here, but that doesn't mean that you're gonna the next throw will be heads, or the next throw will be red or black. So it's an illustration of this idea that even though on average things might be a certain way, we just can't predict. We can't say that just because it was heads last time, it's going to be tails this time. So it's a really intelligent investigation of these ideas.
One of the things I want to bridge us from the 19th to the 20th century, and I think the perfect way to do that is with an analysis of Lewis Carroll's works. And Lewis
Yeah.
Carroll, of course, is best known. He did other things, but he's best known for being the author of Alice in Wonderland, or Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Yeah.
But I read the books as a teenager, but I haven't gone back to the original text since then. And something that escaped me in my reading of the text of those books when I did the first time, that you brought forth, is that Lewis Carroll was obsessed with a particular number, and it's a number that has resonance today among the geeky community, of which I am a proud member. So, can you please tell us what that number is, why and how it was prominent in Lewis Carroll's book, and in case someone is not familiar with its current meaning, why folks like myself were immediately recognized it immediately.
Yeah. So, Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematician at the University of Oxford, and he also wrote these lovely novels for children, Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. There was a particular number that he seemed to very much enjoy, and it crops up in lots of his writing, in the Alice books, but also in his poems, in The Hunting of the Snark and others. And that number is 42. And you see this number all over the place, both in plain sight and also cunningly hidden in the Alice books and elsewhere. And I can give you some of those examples, but perhaps to explain why this makes, yes, as you say, every geek in the world will be very happy when they hear mention of the number 42, is because of the book The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, who was a genius, and in that book, so you've got an everyman figure, Arthur Dent, who goes exploring around the galaxy in his dressing gown, wanting cups of tea because he's very English. And at some point, they encounter this species of 5-dimensional hyper beings who manifest in our dimension as mice, but they're not really. And they've built a super gigantic computer known as Deep Thought. And they have asked it, come on, computer, let's just find out once and for all, what is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? And the computer says, it's going to take me a while. It's going to take me 7.5 million years to work this out. So at the end of this long, long time, they go back, and when the descendants of the original people go back, and they say, right, do you know it? Yes, says the computer, I do know. What is it? The answer to life, the universe, and everything, they've waited 7.5 million years to hear this, is 42. And this causes some befuddlement, let's say. Why? What do you mean? And then the computer says, well, I think the problem is you didn't really know what the question was. So then there's a whole more adventure about what is the question. And, if you want to find out more about that, you'll have to read those books. But so 42 has taken on this iconic resonance for everyone who loves that book, as it's the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And Douglas Adams, I mean, he was a fan of Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll features this number 42. He never explained why, and there are lots of competing theories, and I don't think anyone's come up with a perfect theory yet as to why he likes this number. Sometimes we just like a number. That's all right.
Some people love blue. Some people's favorite color is green or red, and it's a preference, right? There's not.
Yes, exactly. All numbers are our friends. We don't have favorites, but sometimes we have a particular affinity for a certain number. So, for instance, Alice in Wonderland, there are lots of 42s hidden away. So, for instance, at one point in Through the Looking Glass, Alice is talking to, I think, the Red Queen, and she's asked, how old are you? And the answer Alice gives is 7 years and 6 months. So that's 7 and 6. 7 times 6 is 42. Very nice. But then there's a subtler reference to it, because Through the Looking Glass is kind of based around a game of chess. That's its structure. So the queens in the chess set, the Red Queen and the White Queen, their ages are given in this book, and the age that they give, it's something like 105 years and a certain number of months and a certain number of days, which I forget in the moment. But that is a sort of a strangely exact number. And Martin Gardner pointed out, so the famous recreational mathematician and author Martin Gardner pointed out that if you look at those ages and you work out the combined ages of these queens in days, it's actually 42 cubed, right? And like that can't be a coincidence. That can't be a coincidence. So that's a little hidden thing, and you're not going to notice that on your first reading of the book. He's done that. He's probably just done it for his own amusement to put it in there. But if you know about 42 and you think he's a mathematician, no number he puts in his books is going to be random, right? So yeah, it's fun.
I mean, I think it's important to note that this doesn't hint at some deeper meaning. Like we get into, like you mentioned astrology earlier, and in a work, and you mentioned like that's not the mathematical part of things. Like it's not a scientific enterprise, but a lot of times, or in a lot of areas, particularly with religious texts, although not exclusively, scholars examine the numbers in them and say, like, this verse added to that verse gives you to that verse, and when you take the third word and the seventh word, and there's a reason, like there's a justification for the third word, it delivers this message. And so this message that we extract from the text has special meaning, and it's important, and we have to really take it seriously. That's not what you're doing here. This is when we're talking about examining. This is done for appreciation. This is done for enjoyment, and these subtle clues are there perhaps for just Carroll's own enjoyment, and then you get vicarious
Yes.
You get vicarious pleasure by enjoying, I guess, what we would now call an Easter egg.
Yes, exactly, exactly. Yeah, so and he does this at different levels. So you don't need to spot that exact hidden away little treat. If you spot it, it's a little bonus. But elsewhere in the book in Alice in Wonderland, there's the famous scene where she's on trial in a law court, and the King of Hearts is saying, did the Jack of Hearts steal the tarts? And at some point, when Alice starts growing suddenly again, which she does, growing and shrinking through the book, they quote Rule 42 of the court, which is no one's allowed to be more than a mile high, right? And I think he says the king says, this is our oldest rule, and she said, well, why is it number 42 then? Surely it should be rule 1. Anyway, so there's this little back and forth. So he's got this number he likes. He throws it in for his amusement, for our amusement, but it's not a case of cherry picking in the sense that you might find, in any text, there are many ways in which you could say, right, we'll read every 5th letter, or we'll read every 6th letter, or every 7th letter. And there are so many possible ways that you could pick out sequences of letters that you're going to find. If you do that and then only keep the ones that give you sense rather than nonsense, then you can find patterns if you look hard enough. But that's not. You're right. That's not what's happening here. I think what I want to sort of share with people is that authors consciously can exploit pattern and structure to do something that enriches what the literature is saying. So yeah, that's what it is.
And I want to let people know that, because we haven't mentioned it yet, your book is funny. I laughed at several points, and the one that I think made me laugh the hardest. And again, I felt it might be just my personality or my history, but you wrote there should be trigger warnings for mathematicians at the start of a chapter in the Da Vinci Code. Yeah. And that made me laugh because it's a book that I read, and I didn't think of it in those terms, but I was definitely rolling my eyes at certain inferences that were needed for the plot to drive forward. Yeah. So, in case there are actual mathematicians who are listening, as opposed to me, who's just got a degree, and they haven't yet but are planning to read the Da Vinci Code, can you do a public service, please, and say what the trigger warning would be? And because so far all of our examples have been wonderful mathematics within literature, and that's not. Let's be honest, that's not universally the case.
Yeah. So I think with the Da Vinci Code, there were a few sources, perhaps, of be ready. You may feel some exasperation at points. So you've got this guy, Langdon, who is a symbologist, which I'm not sure how real of a thing that is. Anyway, he's a symbologist, and there's a scene where he's giving a lecture to his adoring students, and he's talking about the number phi, or I think in America perhaps it's pronounced phi, so phi or phi, but not fo or fum. And this, no, not that. This number actually arises naturally in the Fibonacci sequence, because if you take consecutive terms and divide one by the previous one, so we had 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. If you do 13 divided by 8, or 21 divided by 13, or 34 divided by 21, that pattern gets closer and closer and closer to one particular number, which we call phi, or the golden ratio, and it's believed to have to be particularly beautiful proportions for a rectangle in that shape is meant to be very beautiful. It does crop up in nature. It's a very interesting number, but the pudding is over-egged in the book. So the first thing he does is he makes this pun. He says that phi, as mathematicians like to say, is 1/h of a lot cooler than pi, because it's got an H in it. So it's like already groaning, because I'm not sure that we do like to say that. But then he makes the cardinal error of saying that it equals 1.618. Now, I know you can't fit an entire infinite decimal in a book because it's infinite, but it's not an exact number. And one of the beautiful properties of this number phi is that it is an irrational number in that its decimal expansion goes on forever, like pi. And that, in fact, is one of the key reasons why the writer Luca Pacioli back in the 16th century wrote about this number, called it the divine proportion, because it goes on forever and is unknowable like God. So if you just cut it off at its prime like that in a cruel way, after 3 digits of the decimal, and say that it equals this number, that made me very upset. Also, Dan Brown says that Fibonacci invented the Fibonacci sequence, which you can't even be said to invent this thing. You have to discover it, but he didn't discover it. So there's that. So there's a bit of stuff about phi, which the golden ratio, which is not. A lot of it isn't quite how I would discuss that number. But then there are other things. So in this book, they have to go on there's some deep secret hidden at the heart of the church, which is going to be blown open by our symbologist hero, and he essentially has to run around across Europe solving secret codes that are hidden away in various pictures and other places. But the codes themselves, the encryption methods, are some of the simplest the simplest methods you could ever imagine. And I got a little frustrated where they'd have the cryptographer from the secret agency is saying, oh, how are we going to solve this? And then they realize it's it's very, very simple code that's been known since for thousands of years. And these codes are very easy to solve using simple techniques. So that's another bit of frustration. But yeah, I think that book is you know what? Sometimes you do need just a nice simple bit of hokum. And if you're prepared to, I have no objection to that, but I think you have to just check your higher thought processes out the door and realize, yeah, you know what? I'm just gonna let it flow over me. That's the way to approach that book. But yeah.
Yeah, and it gets into somewhere else. That reminds me of another thing that you wrote about science fiction, right? So I'm just going to quote a wonderful sentence that you wrote. What I think appeals to a lot of people in Asimov's books is the beguiling fantasy that scientists, and especially mathematicians, are driven by pure reason, that cleverness can get you out of any fix, and that everything can finally make sense if you can just ramify the ninth dimensional asymptotes over a tangential vector field. Now, I didn't memorize that. I wrote that down because and again, that made me laugh. And what that reminded me of more than anything else was about 25 different Star Trek episodes. Where we have to reverse the polarity of the neutron flow or something. It's the way that they solve problems. I'm not a scientist, but even I know neutrons don't have polarity. That doesn't work. But writers are going tack 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 tack, and then someone puts some verbiage in. So I mean, I think that can you talk a little bit about how sometimes the language of mathematics, I've seen some people talk about science-ish, truthiness, science-ish, about how mathematical language is sometimes employed not to elucidate but to obfuscate in literature.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, you get these sort of these characters who their role is to provide a solution to something, and it's not intended to be something that's understandable. In fact, it's like those medical dramas where it's all like 20 cc's of something stat and all the words are there, and it's a simulacrum of mathematics in this case, or something that sounds, as you say, sciencey. And I think of this as there was an old commercial where they said, "Here comes the science bit," and I remember that and enjoyed it at the time because you can say words that sound sort of right, and sometimes that's what happens in books, and you get a mathematically sounding thing. But it doesn't really make any sense, and often you'll see this. In fact, I quite enjoy if I'm watching a film that's got something sciencey in it, or a maths genius, the cliche of the maths genius, the mathematics genius who can't cope with the world, but they suddenly get a great idea and then they write all their equations on the tablecloth or on the wall or something because they're in a frenzy of invention. And so you see all these Greek letters and sigmas and n's and stuff all over the place, and it's a pastiche. It's a pastiche, and that's okay. And it doesn't make sense. I remember that the X-Files. This is aging me, but the X-Files. They made a movie,
yes.
and I remember when it came out, the ad said fear to the power of X, and I said, but X could be a very small number. X could be a negative number. So that's another. If you're mathematically minded, then laughing at commercials that say things that aren't very convincing is another amusing pastime. If you say, this thing is up to twice as effective, and then my children, they're so bored of me doing this because they just chorus now. Up to includes 0.
Yes,
yeah, I've got them trained.
It reminds me. My favorite webcomic, which probably won't surprise you, is XKCD.
Of course.
And my favorite XKCD is like Fields of Human Endeavor arranged by Purity. And then someone says that sociology is just applied psychology. And then they have someone else saying, well, psychology is just applied biology. And then you've got a woman saying biology is just applied chemistry, which is really just applied physics. It's nice to be on top. And then you've got like way off to the side, you've got someone labeled a mathematician. It's like, oh, hey, I didn't even see you guys over there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true, but it certainly earned a belly laugh when I read that.
That's funny.
It's like that's the only purity test that I want to take.
Absolutely. And I think even within mathematics, you get this same kind. Well, there's applied mathematics, which has uses in the real world. I think literature is fiction, and mathematics, pure mathematics, in a way, is fiction too. It's a created world because if you're doing mathematics, the things you're dealing with, circles, right? There's no such thing as a real perfect circle in reality because there'll always be a tiny imperfection. It won't quite have the same. But the idea of a circle, it's a simplification of life which allows us to think about and study the deeper properties. And actually, in fiction, in literature, that's exactly what's happening as well. You take people, characters, and you put them in a situation which doesn't have all the messy stuff of reality. You focus on a particular situation that they're in, and that allows you to think about the deeper truths of human behavior and emotion. So it feels as if almost it's a similar process where we are taking things and looking at them carefully, and perhaps not including every single last detail, so that we can get to the deeper truths. So I'm as a pure mathematician, I don't have that much contact with reality. Every so often I'll drop in on it.
But unfortunately, reality actually does. Even pure mathematicians have to deal with reality. Contra to my favorite XKCD cartoon, and you write about that in part two. There's a 19th century mathematician, Kovalevskaya. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing her name properly. And I want to read again another quotation. What you write about her. They had given her the Borden Prize, which is a very prestigious prize in mathematics. They had kissed her hand and presented her with speeches and flowers in the most elegant, lavishly lit rooms. But they had closed their doors when it came to giving her a job. They would no more think of that than employing a learned chimpanzee.
Mm.
And I, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about your own experience. I know that when I was an undergrad, women were maybe 20% in
Mhm.
the mathematics faculty, and the more you went, like my major within the mathematics faculty was computer science, and there was a higher proportion of women there. But there was a smaller proportion in applied mathematics, and there was an even smaller proportion in pure mathematics. And you are the first chair of the first female chair of pure mathematics at your university. I'm wondering how much of that mindset among what is still predominantly male a male field, how much of that misogyny, even if it's unthinking and not cruel, they were happy to vet her, they celebrated her success, but just couldn't even conceive of offering her a job. That's still misogynistic, even if it's not necessarily malicious. How much of that is still there today? And how much did you experience, and what's it like for women, young women, girls even, that are interested in mathematics? I mean, I remember Barbie dolls. You pull the cord. This is going back a couple decades now, so it's not today. But you pull a cord, and one of the things that the Barbie doll would say is, "Math is hard."
Yeah, yeah.
So, uh, uh, how much of that do you still see today? How much of that did you experience? And is there anything that you would like to say to girls and young women who are considering pursuing studies or even a career in a mathematical field?
Yeah. So that quotation that you read, it comes from a wonderful story by Alice Munro called "Too Much Happiness" about Kovalevskaya, and she at that time, 19th century, it was so unusual for women to be allowed even to pursue studies in mathematics, and then the ones who did and were successful, it was very difficult to be taken seriously because you had to keep proving yourself over and over again. I think so nowadays, of course, things have improved a lot. There is, I think, I mean, when I was at university and even thinking about going to university, it was felt by, I think, a lot of people at the time that, women maybe can actually do mathematics, great. But it was openly said by lots of people at that time that this bell curve idea, where intelligence, and again, problematic. How do you measure intelligence? Who's designing the tests? Who gets to say what intelligence really is? But there was this theory that, okay, women on average are slightly, the average woman has a very slightly higher IQ than the average man, whatever that means. But at the tail ends, the extremes, that somehow there are more men at both extremes, in fact. So I was
Right.
told a few times that,
So
yeah,
really stupid men and really,
yeah,
really stupid,
yeah,
really, really stupid men, but also really, really smart
exactly,
men.
exactly.
And
So
women
yeah,
just, they're not
there's
as
no way.
dumb, but they're also
Yeah, not
not as smart.
so I
Okay.
was, it was sort of openly the view in some quarters that you could be a pretty good mathematician if you're a woman, but you were never going to be the absolute top because the outliers are the men. Now I don't believe that. I think it's a sort of self-justifying thing. And again, that there can be this perception that mathematics, the argument goes something like this: mathematics is completely objective because it's all pure logic, and therefore the fact that, so far in history the top people have all been men must mean that that's just men are better than women at math. Now there are so many so many things you could say to refute that, like, okay, yes, you have to follow a chain of reasoning in a mathematical proof, but who gets to decide what the important proofs are? Who gets to decide who gets to spend so much time isolated thinking about the difficult problems? All of these things are social situations that people are in, interfere with that alleged objectivity. So that argument doesn't really wash. I think the open the open misogyny of the kind that, women are never going to be as good, that I hope has gone. At least no one's saying it to me. Maybe they are saying it to young women, but I think there is still an aura of, if you walk into a place and nearly everyone else is a man, however this people speak to you, subconsciously, I think there is perhaps a challenge to feel that you're part of that group, whether it's open or not. And I think that's something, I feel as a woman mathematician, although I don't want to be thought of as a woman mathematician. In other words, don't compare me to the men. That's not what I want. But I think I do think it's important that I be willing, and I am willing to be visible in the sense of talking about my work, talking about how much I enjoy doing mathematics, talking about the fact that, for instance, it's absolutely possible to, have a family, have kids, to take the weekends off, those kind of things. You don't have to be totally like doing mathematics all day long and all night long. You can have a normal life and still be a good mathematician. And that's, I think, an important message, because sometimes it's said that, well, okay, women can be great mathematicians, but, then when they have kids, it's really hard to focus, and then I always think, well, it's so weird, because I thought kids had to have like a father as well as a mother. And I see a lot of my male colleagues also have children, and they don't seem to think that that's going to hinder their work. So, these things are perhaps felt and not thought through, that people don't necessarily think through the implications of the case that they're implying, that they're inherently making when they say childcare can be a problem, because it doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be only a challenge for women to arrange childcare of the children they have with the men, So yeah, I think there are challenges, but if you're a young woman, or you're in high school, you enjoy mathematics, it's fun. It's like, what could be better than solving puzzles and finding patterns? It's great. I think just my advice is really do the things that you like doing and that you love doing. So for me, when I grew up, I loved playing the piano. I loved reading books. I loved doing mathematics. And I've kept up with those things. Mathematics I chose to carry on and pursue for my career to begin with. But then, now I've come back to these other loves, and I've been just privileged to be able to write about literature and about, these lovely links between mathematics and the arts. So even if you think, well, I don't want to be a rocket scientist, that's no reason not to do mathematics, because it really is so powerful and wonderful a subject.
Well, I certainly agree. I thoroughly enjoyed your book, Once Upon a Prime. Is there another book coming from you? Can we look forward to another?
Well, yes. So I am writing a book about the connections now between mathematics and music, which is another of my great loves.
Oh, wonderful.
So yeah, hopefully that'll be out in, I think, spring 2027. So
okay. Well, I will definitely look for that in a couple of years. But I just want to say thank you for Once Upon a Prime. It merges two of my great passions in life, and it was a wonderful read. There's so much more in the book that we didn't get to cover today. But Sarah Hart, thank you for a wonderful conversation, for sitting down with me, and thank you for being a guest today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you. It's been lovely talking to you.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.